Okay, so good morning, everyone. So today we are going to discuss on the withholding tax. Withholding tax is one of the important concept topic in the AP module, and this is only in the AP module. So we have two types of taxes. One is the transaction tax, so that is similar to like GST, and this is mostly like a supplier or vendor tax, which is withholding tax. So let's say, for example, we have created or we have created a 10,000 invoice for ABC supplier. So let's assume that there is a 5% withholding tax. So withholding tax is nothing but on behalf of supplier or vendor, we are going to pay to the government. So based on the percentage is already decided by the government, like how much will be the withholding tax. So let's assume that, for example, I'm providing you the training, so I'm a supplier for you. So whatever, like 5%, 10%. So that tax, when I send you the invoice, from that, a 10% of tax will be deducted, and you will pay me 100 minus 10%, you will pay me only 90% invoice amount, and the rest of 10% will go to the government tax authority. In shortcut, we call it as a GTA. So you could see here. And the other part of this withholding taxes, whatever the amount of 500 when it is being deducted from the supplier account and paid to GTA, system is going to create a invoice, automatic invoice in the favor of GTA. So here we are going to create a supplier as GTA, and we are going to proceed with the setup. So few important things are we need to consider when we are going to have the withholding tax. So we are going to create a tax authority supplier as type as tax authority. It is mandatory to create this type. Otherwise, this withholding tax will not work. So we are going to have tax reporting and withholding tax options, tax codes, classification. Then we assign this tax classification to the standard suppliers. Standard supplier means any supplier other than the GTA. So then we are going to create standard invoice. System will create withholding tax invoice. So we make a payment to standard supplier as well to the tax authority. So this payment happens through the PPR or manual payments. So I have highlighted this already in the PPT. I have copied this as well. Please refer it under the 66 batch under the AP module. There is a file name as withholding tax. Kindly refer that and follow the same steps what I have mentioned in that. So it will be easy for you to have the setup as well. The first thing is like we have a supplier. So we are going to have the tax organization type as government agency. If you remember for the normal supplier, we used to give here as a corporation, but here we are going to give it as a government agency. And here, when we are going to continue on the tax, supplier type will be tax authority. So these two are major important points we need to remember when we create the supplier. What implications happens if I don't give this? I will discuss on this as well. So in the interview also, they will ask what are the major two changes which we need to do in the supplier when we are going to create. One is tax organization type and the other is the supplier type. These two are the major changes, others are normal thing. So let's get into the system. We define this supplier first. Then we will move to the relevant setup as well. So I'm still into this Dave 55. I think we also received Dave 99, I guess, one of the instance. Will now be get into the first is the supplier. So I click on procurement supplier. We are going to create supplier. So supplier I'm going to mention as GTA. In short, we call it. So it's called as government tax authority. Business relationship is spent and tax organization type is government agency. This is must to mention. Click on create. So we have the supplier as GTA. This is the supply number and tax organization type is government agency. And there is one more mandatory step. Supplier type is here we need to mention as tax authority. Even though it doesn't mark it as mandatory, but this is very important. What happens in case if I forget to give here tax authority, I will show that as. So the rest is common, like we continue defining it as a other options over here. So addresses, is for review. Just pay side, nothing else. Close. Click on sites, edit. So we click on this site assignments. What to create revenues. That's it. So we created the supplier, which is with the government tax. So this is done now. We move to the relevant setup. So we go to payables, sorry, setup and maintenance. Then we move to something called as manage tax reporting. Payables. So here we are going to click on Alt. So we have something called as manage tax reporting. So this is the one, manage tax reporting and withholding tax options. So we have to start with this one. We click on this. I'm going to select the BU. which I'm going to enable it. So you could see here, manage tax options. So business unit is this one. So if I have multiple business units, for each business unit, we need to do this activity. You could see here that we have event class, so where we are going to select it. So we can have for both for standard invoices and prepayment invoices. So both for multiple we can create one by one, or based on the business it can be standard invoice or prepayment or both either. So we select standard invoices. So you could see here, apply withholding, process transaction taxes, allow manual withholding. Allow manual withholding means in case normally the system will create the withholding tax. For some reasons it is not creating. We can also do it creating manually, or we can edit the tax manually. So it is not recommended to mark it, but anyhow we just keep it. So calculation point is invoice or payment. Some organizations they prefer invoice. Some organizations they prefer payment. The reason is invoice, maybe there is a possibility that we created the invoice and at the last moment we cancel the invoice. So then when we are going to create and cancel, and if you are going to reverse that invoice, we also need to reverse the taxation. So for that reason, mostly some organizations they keep it at payment level, but some organizations they keep it at invoice level. So we'll keep it at invoice. Tax creation
What is the standard
standard
basically?
is invoice at invoice level. So tax invoice creation point is invoice. So here rounding level is at header. Start date is mandatory. So we are going to give it 1st October. I can give it 2 days as well, but let's give it. And we cannot delete this. The only way is to have the end date. And we can either enable or disable as well. So this is the first step and it is mandatory as well. Any questions here?
Sir, the tax calculation, is this the same setup we have to do for all types of tax calculation? Is this like the general setup, or do we have some other module where we do the configuration? Uh, for example, what I've seen in UAE by 2017, they implemented VAT.
Right.
Uh,
That is
so
different.
Okay. So in
Yeah.
that case also we are we doing this same similar type of setup, or are we
No.
following different
Okay. So in UAE, if you see, there are two types of taxes. One is the withholding tax, other is the VAT. So I don't think withholding they have currently, but in other regions we have it withholding tax. And VAT is something similar to GST in India, value added tax, as you mentioned. So that setup is different, and we are going to cover once I start the receivables. And there is a separate tax module which will be we will be working on that to define those taxes. So that is something called as a fusion tax. And in the EBS it is called as EBS tax, and that is exclusively for the VAT, for the GST and European and US and all those taxes. So this withholding tax is part of the AP module, only AP. But the other tax is part of the AP, AR, payroll, and fusion expenses as. So we will have a separate session on the fusion taxes.
What is the main difference between withholding tax and VAT or GST, sir?
Okay, so withholding tax is something we are deducting from the supplier, and the other tax VAT normally is like, let's say, for example, I go to any restaurant to have dinner. So normally in India, if you see, we get 18% tax on that. So 9% it goes to state tax, 9% it goes to central. So that is nothing but a service tax. Normally we call it a plus is GST. Even if you see on the fuel as well, we have the taxation. And the only difference is here, if supplier is supplying any commodities, items, or services is providing, we will be deducting on behalf of supplier and paying to the government taxes. And in the VAT or the GST, it will be direct deduction, irrespective of any supplier, any customer, it will be direct deduction. That is the major difference. And in some countries, we do still we don't have withholding tax. In some countries, still we don't have GST, but majority of the countries we have both. As this is the major difference.
Means withholding tax is nothing but the TDS kind of.
No, I don't prefer it as yes. In one way, yes, for the supplier point, because the moment supplier sent us, we deducted the source. So tax deducted source TDS. Yes, you can say that.
But if I'm not wrong, in India we do not use the word withholding tax, right? Uh, it is majorly used in North America side.
Yes, North America and Middle East, they use this withholding tax. But most of the countries, they use this word. So that is why, if you could see here, withholding tax, they mention it, even in the application also.
Okay, thank you.
And the major other difference between the withholding tax and the other VAT or GST is GST or VAT is very wide scope. Here we are just limited to percentage. For example, it's been decided by the government 5%. That's it. Based on the supplier invoice, it is deducted. But in VAT or GST, we can have it based on location. We can have it based on product as well. For example, if let's say that I am a medicine producing organization, like I'm supporting any life-saving drug, so like diabetic or any other heart diseases, so I get a taxation of 2%. But at the same time, if I am a ITC Indian Tobacco Company, where I'm producing or I'm into the cigarettes, such sort of stuff, then I need to pay 20% tax. So that differentiation of product wise will be handled in fusion taxation. It can be product wise, even it can be location as well. Location means if I'm in a union territory like Delhi and Andaman Nicobar, my tax will be different other than metro. If I'm into Chhattisgarh, where there is a lot of development required, then there is a different tax. So based on location as well, but that is in the VAT or the GST side. And this is very straightforward irrespective of any supplier, anything. Just deduct 5%. That's it. Straightforward. So this is the first step which we have defined for the tax holding options. Then we have something called as to define the tax code. So we have here manage tax code. Click on this. So here we are going to create the tax code. So I click on this create button. So you could see here create withholding tax code, and we are going to have the business unit. Only those business units, like for example earlier what we have done, first we enable the withholding tax for that business unit. We gave tax point calculation and all those, then only it will appear here. That is the reason we have to follow an order in which these setups needs to be executed. So I'm going to select the business unit, countries, India, tax regime code. This is something new. Tax regime code is to identify, like let's say I have multiple taxes to be created, we can do that. At least one tax regime code is important. I click on create. So here I'm just going to mention as AMZ tax regime start date. First, save and close. And tax, it's the first time we are creating this regime code and tax, so we need to click on me. So here I'm going to mention as AMZW withholding tax, and you could see the start date. Can we mention the same tax liability account? So if you recall, whenever we are going to create any invoices, we have two options to enter the account. One is the common invoice options, procurement and invoice, or we give it the supplier site level. So this tax one is related to a separate supplier, GTA, Government Tax Authority. So we are going to give that liability account to one. This is mandatory. I have already created, oh sure, I don't think I have created. So I need to have one account to be created for this. Is anyone accessing the system right now? Can anyone quickly create a value set? One value I need, if possible, otherwise I will do it. Can anyone do it? Because I have to exit. Okay, as of now, let me take this account. I will change this account. So here you have the tax authority. Now, one important thing is, in case, let's assume that in if I'm not going to mention the supplier as tax authority, the type as tax authority, then I will not get this supply details here. You could see here GTA. Only it is coming because we have mentioned the type as tax authority. So this is the one we need to consider. Site is something which we have created. Then zero tax, nothing like that, because we create a full tax. Set tax for reporting. So some organizations, they just want to check. They don't want to create any transaction, but only for the reporting purposes. If you mark this, system will create only reporting tax. It doesn't create any transaction, but it is not the case. So we are going to have save and close. So here you could see all are asterisk, means all are mandatory. So this setup is mandatory. So now we are going to define the rate code. Rate code is something where, so this is decided by the government or by the law, like for withholding tax, it will be 5% or 10% or whatever it is. So we will create a tax rate code as AMZ. I would like to have 10%. Right. So whether it should be on percent, line amount, gross rate amount, withhold amount. So here, 99% cases, all cases have percentage determined by the government. So there is something called as create tax classification code. If I click this, system will directly create, but I will create separately and I will show you how to do that as well. Now you could see that there are thresholds. Ignore these thresholds, not applicable, but the rate periods is applicable. So this is where we are going to determine how much percentage is going to be. If I mention here 10% and I give here 5%, system will calculate 5% because this is the area where system is going to calculate it. So I click on this. So I'm going to mention 10%. The start date is, and I can give the rate period name as, let's say, 10 2024. Case if you want to give, you could see the ledger and the tax liability account. So this is coming from the account we just give few minutes back. So rate period name, we can have it like this, or we can also have as AMZ withholding tax percent. One important thing is, now let's say for example, normally the government decides, okay, for October this will be 10%, for November it will be 5%. So we can give multiple lines. The only thing is there should be a end date. So if I want to give another one starting from November onwards, or let's say 16th of October, it should be calculated 5%, then we should have the effective end date. Without end date, we cannot create here the other line. So let's say we are going to have it till 14th or till 15th, we have 10%, and from 16th of October, we are going to have till December 31st, let's say, for example, 5%. So in this way, what happens is, so we can just mention as AMZWHT 5% for November, December, for example, something like this. So in this way, we can give multiple as well. So till 15th, system will calculate 10. Now, the moment I have an invoice being created on 16th of October, system will calculate on 5%. End date, at least for this one, is mandatory because we are ending here 15th of October and we are starting on 16th. For this, it's not mandatory. Maybe if we don't give, it will continue till next so and so years, till I end it over here. But in case if I have multiple lines, one definitely should have an end date and it cannot overlap. For example, I mention here as 15 and 16 here. I cannot mention here as 15 as well because system will get confused which one to consider. So that is one of the things. So now we are going to save and close. So we are done with the tax code. Now the next one is the, and meanwhile, let me quickly create one account which will be exclusively for GT. Close. Go back to tables or tasks. We have tax rate codes, manage tax codes. Click on this. We can search starting with or contains or whatever it is. We can query on this. Search for it. We can go back and edit. So here we have the, so whenever the invoice is being created, this account will be the liability account for the tax authority. Now this is done. So the next one is the manage withholding tax classification. So we need to define the tax classification because this is the tax classification which is going to be attached to the supplier. Why? What is the reason? I will discuss now. So let's say I'm going to have AMZ WHT tax classification. The WHT tax classification started, let's say, first, and here we are going to have direct tax rate rules. We are not having any compounding. So here we are going to select the business unit. So the purpose of this one is maybe I have 100 suppliers. Maybe for out of 100, we are going to have tax calculation only for selected suppliers or 50 suppliers. So for that reason, we are going to have this. So this is we have already defined. So we are just going to select it. Save and close. So now we are done with all the relevant tax setup. We started with defining the, first we initiated with the tax options. Then we have defined the tax code. Now we have defined the withholding tax options. So now let's assume that I have 50 suppliers, but out of it, only selected 20 or 30 will be having this tax calculation. Why other suppliers will not have? So there is a business reason. Normally what happens is some of the suppliers who are producing, as I mentioned, life-saving drugs, or some suppliers who are supporting the NGOs, or some suppliers who are into defense manufacturing, serving the nation, like they are manufacturing all those equipments and all those. So they may be exempted from this withholding tax. So for that reason, instead of having one tax classification for all the 1,000 suppliers, we can have it exclusively attached to the relevant supplier only. So we already have a supplier with Amazon ABC. So we are going to attach to that supplier. What happens if I don't attach to that supplier this tax classification? Even though we created, we enable, it will not work unless and until we go ahead and assign it. So we are going to have manage suppliers. Let's query the supplier. So this is the one. Click on edit. So if you see here something on the transaction tax, so this is something called as a tax classification code, which we can mention it. Apart from that, we also have something called as withholding tax group, use withholding. So we are going to select the tax group over here. So the one which we have defined, this is the one which we are going to attach. So this is at the profile level. It is not mandatory to define here or sorry to assign here. And there is the site level we have to assign it or assign it. So I have it the site, I click on sites, edit. Now I go to the site assignments. You could see here something, use withholding tax group. Now you could see one of the tax liability. So this is a normal liability distribution for this supplier. And I click on this, use withholding tax. So I'm going to select it from this. If I don't give it here on the supplier level, the tax will not be calculated for this supplier. So this is mandatory. Use withholding tax. So this one you are going to enable. Save and close. Now as relevant all the setups are done by us as a consultant. Now the user is going to enter the invoices. So those invoices which are already created, we cannot have any tax now because those are already validated, accounted. In case if it was not validated, we would have the system will calculate the tax because we are giving it from the date of 1st of October. So I'm going to create an invoice now. So invoice date is 15. And I will change the invoice date. WHT withholding tax 001. Let's say I'm going to have 10,000 and the date I want to give it 8th of October. See, date, let's be 13th. The lines here on 10,000. So here I'm going to have Then we go start, save. Is still not validated, and you could see that there is nothing called as withholding here. It's still 00. So now we are going to validate. So it has been validated. Now you could see that withholding has been created as 1000 here, and automatically the due is 9000. So the payment to the supplier will go as a 9000, not as 10,000. Why? Because 1000 is being withheld or being deducted. And if I click over here in taxes, it will show us what tax we are talking about. So you could see here there are two types of taxes. This transaction tax is nothing but VAT or GST, and we have withholding taxes. So withholding taxes, if you recall, we have this rate name, rate is 10, and you could see here calculation point is invoice and this detail. And you could see here edit taxes. The reason is, if you recall, when I given the first tax setup, I have allow manual creation I have mentioned. So that is the reason I can go ahead and edit the taxes here. Means I can make it as 0, for example, or I want to create and I can do that, but it is not recommended in the organization. So now you could see 1000 has been created. So if you go and create the accounting, let's post to lecture. So system is going to have liability of 9000 and tax as 1000. Now let's review this accounting. So you could see here accrual is 10,000, liability is 1000, and you could see the liability is debited 1000 because it's already deducted, and you could see it's 10,000, and the withholding tax is 1000. And if you could see here, so system is going to have GTA, tax liability account. This 1000 is going to the tax authority. This is fine. And the other thing is, system should be able to create a invoice for this. So now we could see that if I click over here, the one which we created, 10,000, it is showing, but it is not showing the invoice being created for the GTA. It doesn't show here. So we have to either query here or we can query. So supplier, we need to query. I click on this. That is GTA. So this is the one, supply number 60. We need to search if any transaction has been created or not. And you could see here one transaction or one invoice had been created. We did not created it manually. It has been created by the system. So If it is being created by the system, then only your setup is perfect. If it is not being created, means there is some issue in the setup. And auditing and the government authority, they normally see that these invoices are created by the system. They don't accept if it is being created manually. How they will come to know? You could see here that the supplier and all these, you could see the supplier is GTA, that is fine. Invoice type will be withholding tax. Unless and until if it is manual, if I create manually, I cannot create the invoice type as withholding tax. I have either create as standard or debit memo or credit memo, but not prepayment, but not as a withholding tax. So what normally they do is government says when you are going to submit the report of these invoices, also share with us the column of invoice type because they want to cross verify if you had created manually or system generated. Because if I have a understanding with the supplier, because suppliers will not be interested to pay this much tax, they say you create manually and I will pay you. You create for 500 and the 200 you take, 300 I take, something like that. So to avoid such frauds, it needs to be generated automatically. And you could see here lines. So this is the one which is created. Supplier details they will give in this one. And again, we follow the same process for this one where we are going to validate and we are going to make a payment. And for them, there is nothing called as immediate payment terms. Sorry, it will be payment terms will be immediate because supplier GTA is not negotiating with us to pay in 30 days, 60 days. No. The moment invoice is generated, the withholding tax has to be in their favor. And the rest is as it is. We are going to validate. We are going to post to ledger. We can make pay in full from here. We also have option to pay by manual payment. We can also make it through PPR. So when we run PPR, it goes for both suppliers, ABC and GTA as well. Now you could see the accounting here. This is the GTA liability tax account which is debited, and you could see here it is not being credited to the cash or cash clearing. It is being credited to the, sorry, this invoice when we are going to create, it is not having inventory accrual or something. It takes directly the ABC supplier. Why? Because the base for this invoice being generated is the ABC supplier. So for that reason, it will be having the supplier as credit and item expense as debit, whatever the relevant account is. So this is all about the invoice. Now let's say for example, if I'm going to create an invoice which is with date of 16th or 18th October anything, so system should calculate the other rate because we have restricted only till so and so date. Withholding tax demo 002. So I entered here 20,000, let's say, and my date here is 22 October. If you must enter an invoice date that is today's or earlier date. To this date accounting. So this is 22. So if you remember, we have mentioned that system should have only the dates which are pertaining to the, we cannot have to the 4 future dated invoices based on the setup. So here, let's say for example, I'm going to have, at least let's give it 15th, change it to 15th, save. So now, I guess we have given till 14th, so validated. So it is 2000. So in case, let's say tomorrow we are going to create, or 16th I'm going to give, system is going to calculate for 5%. Whatever we have given based on that, system is going to calculate. So this is all about the withholding tax. There is something called as transaction tax that we will discuss later on when we do the AR. That's a vast subject. It requires at least 2 separate sessions to handle that setup. So this is all about the taxation, and tomorrow I'm going to cover few of the other topics which are related to holds and payment formats. What is a special calendar? We do have a special calendar in AP that is relevant for the recurring invoices. So we will discuss on that as well. Most probably this week I am targeting to complete the accounts payable module, and Monday onwards we will start the cash management, or I will start with the receivables, or I will start with the fusion expense. I will see the sequence, then we will have.